for us as Christians, we know that Jesus has died for everybody, no matter what his sexual orientation is.
Sure.
And ultimately, as we've seen with the trans movement much more lately, changing of what it means to be a human person, that we are made body and soul, rather than just we wake up one day and we think we're a man trapped in a woman's body or vice versa, which we need to treat these people with compassion. We can't make it the new baseline of what it means to be a human being.
And our special guest is a good friend of mine. His name is Father Roger Landry. He's currently the Catholic chaplain at Columbia University, as well as the former attaché to the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations. He's also a Eucharistic revival preacher. You've probably seen him on TV with a lot of commentaries. He's got a ton of resources at his website, catholicpreachers.org. And so it's great to have you, Father Roger Landry. Thank you for coming. And more importantly, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Father Leo. Thanks for the invitation today.
My pleasure. So currently you are at Columbia. We're going to get to that, but I really want to get the scoop, honestly, of this attaché. That is quite the title. What did you do?
So for 7 years, between 2015 and 2022, I helped the Holy Father's diplomatic work at the United Nations. The world has lots of challenges, certain things going very well, but the Holy See is there at the United Nations. There are 195 countries there to look at these issues, to try to address them as best the international community can. And the Holy See is there trying to bring the great treasure of Catholic social teaching to the challenges, to the problems, to the catastrophes that the world faces. And so for 7 years, we tried to help the world address some of the problems with the light of the Catholic Church's 2,000 years of thinking about not only what's good for individuals, but also what's good for society's living community.
Now, obviously, the Catholic Church, the Vatican itself, is considered its own country. I mean, it's got all the trappings of its own country. But at the Holy See, you're just an observer. Why don't you have that same do they vote on things, or are you just there to be kind of like a leaven and influence people?
So there have been lots of observer countries, observer states, over the history of the United Nations. When the United Nations was founded in 1945, there were only 51 countries who were members. And any country, for example, that was part of the Axis nations, together with Germany against the Allies, they couldn't officially join the United Nations at that point. But the UN wanted them to know what was going on and create some type of path for them to eventually join. And so even though there was nothing in the United Nations Charter for observer states, they took the language from other international organizations and kept it. And so over the course of the UN's history, there have been 18 different observer states. In 2002, Switzerland became a full member state. It had been an observer, leaving the Holy See as the only permanent observer state at the time. And the United Nations approached the Holy See.
And the permanency means that they can't ever kind of cancel you or take you away.
Well, the permanent basically means that every country that is at the UN has the title not of an embassy, but as a permanent mission, not a temporary mission, but a permanent one. And so when the states were adopting permanent observer state status, they kept that adjective there.
Okay.
There's no intention that you'd ever leave, but there have been, over the course of time, various organizations that don't like what the Catholic Church and the Holy See stand for, that have tried to eliminate the Holy See from the UN. So in 2002, when Switzerland became a permanent member state, the United Nations approached the Holy See and said, do you want to follow in their lead so that you become a permanent member state too? Holy See's totally eligible for it. St. John Paul II thought about it for over a year and came back and decided that he wanted the Holy See to remain a permanent observer state so that we wouldn't have to get into the nitty-gritty of voting on everything that comes on up, transcend some of the debate so that we could bring principles. And so in 2004, the UN General Assembly, by unanimous acclamation, not only officially approved the Holy See as a permanent observer state. 40 years earlier, it had affiliated itself with the UN, but also delineated exactly what the rights and the responsibilities of a permanent observer state is at the UN for the first time in UN history. And so the Holy See can do everything any other state. Think about the United States, think about Canada,
so
think
they take
about
you
France.
Seriously.
They take us very seriously. We can do everything everybody else does with three exceptions.
Okay.
We can't vote on resolutions, but that's pretty much a moot point at the UN because by the time anything comes up for a vote, all the problems have been worked out in negotiations in which we can participate vigorously. Second thing is we can't run for office. Not that the Holy Father would ever want to become the Secretary General of the United Nations. And third, we can't initiate a resolution. But for a resolution to pass at the UN, you'd need at least 97 states to vote in favor of it. And we can always find one of the other 97 to be the first one to initiate, or what we call it the UN lingo, table a resolution. So the Holy See,
you can influence, like
country. We influence tremendously. At the UN, most of the negotiations happen only with about 30 of the 195 countries that are there. And the Holy See is one of the louder voices in those negotiations because we try to articulate the hopes and the aspirations of so many small countries, especially in the developed world, who don't have the staff there and might not always have the argumentation.
I was going to ask, how many people are on this Catholic mission to the permanent observer of the whole? I mean, how many people worked under the auspice of the Vatican?
So we were a small team at the UN in New York. We had an archbishop, a nuncio to the United Nations. We had 2 priest diplomats who would have been sent over from Rome. And then we would have 5 other diplomatic staff, myself included, who would work at the UN. And then there was a small support staff, etc. But when you look at the United States, when you look at the Russian Federation, they have 200 trained diplomats.
Oh, Lord.
And so we had to sort of cover, as the technical term, lots of issues where they were able to become specialists on one particular area of the UN's platform.
Okay, so diplomacy. All right, I'm just going to say it right now. I've known you for a very long time, since 1995. That's a long time, and we have been very good friends, even if we are absolute different. Diplomacy. Is that you? Are you a diplomatic kind of guy? And the reason why I ask this is because, and I know you can be, I mean, you're Roman trained, but you also have this incredible way of just like piercing to the truth.
So diplomacy is an art.
Yeah.
And I needed to learn a different temperament when I was there.
Interesting.
Because I'm a blunt guy, and I had previous to entering the seminary worked in politics, and there's a Pacific Ocean between politics and diplomacy.
Interesting.
Politics, as we know from what happens in D.C. and many of the state capitals, is typically win-lose. Whereas to be a successful diplomat, it's win-win. You don't get everything you're looking for, but you need to make sure somebody else isn't humiliated because you're going to have to work together long-term. And so it's more or less what happens in European parliamentary systems than it does in the U.S. political system. And so certain of the things that I needed to learn how to do was to phrase things that are true to our position that others wouldn't find offensive and that they might be able to agree to, because you're getting underneath some of the conclusions to the rationale that others can buy into. So that's the whole art of diplomacy, where you're trying always to make it a win-win in some degree. So that requires a different perspective. It requires a different way of doing things.
Was it hard to do?
It requires saying less rather than more.
Wait, because hold on. Less rather than more. You are a man of many words and big words. I sometimes have to look up like a dictionary when we talk, because you are, I mean, you're an editor of a newspaper. You read so many books. I remember you gave a conference to a group of non-Catholic Christians who even dressed in Roman clerical garb when they came to Rome, and they were overwhelmed in a good way by your presentation. Less words. I want to kind of hear how you got trained. Did you go to the Academia, which is the Vatican Diplomacy School?
I did not go to the Academia, but I learned a lot from Archbishop Auza, who was the nuncio, from the other diplomats who were there.
By the way, Filipino.
Who is a Filipino.
And that's surprising because Filipino uses a lot of words.
He's in the same sentence as Father Leo Petalinga and Cardinal Chito Tagle as the most famous Catholic churchman from the Philippines in the world.
Wait a minute. I'm doing the interview here. I'm doing the interview.
But no, I learned on the fly. It was a very, very big learning curve. In my first 10 days there, I had to write 9 major speeches. That was the nature of the work.
Who do these speeches Who are they given by? The Archbishop?
So they were given by the nuncio, who is the archbishop, the papal ambassador, for example. We would call him to the UN. He trusted me implicitly. There was a great working relationship there. But what I learned how to do was to take the conclusions that we know by faith,
Okay.
phrase them in terms without faith that appeal basically to everybody. And so I was a moral theologian. You studied Marian theology.
Correct.
When we did our advanced studies in Rome.
Which you made fun of me about, but that's okay.
I don't remember that.
Well, I remember, here's why. This is the diplomacy part. This is what cracks me up because, Mariology, patristics, but some of my classmates, including you, would say, "What are you guys learning today? What color outfit she wore at Nikita?" I mean,
so it was like kindergarten, Father Leo, where we always were teasing the teacher's pet and the one who was really excelling.
just called me the teacher's pet. Holy cow. All right.
Okay, nevertheless.
Not very diplomatic of
Back
you, to be honest with you.
to the story.
Yes.
We all were secretly invidious. But what I tried to do is to just try to show the beauty of what the church holds in various areas. So in those 9 speeches in 10 days, half of them had to be given during the annual Commission on the Status of Women. And so I was able to take essentially St. John Paul II's insights about the dignity of women and put it in universally accessible language. And many of the people who were there at the United Nations coming, they're not used to hearing that language. And when you are able to dive down on what it means to be human, what it means to be a woman, we are able to phrase that in terms that easily go beyond the way most people think about it. And so seeing the beauty of what we were saying, they recognize that we speak differently than everybody else. And we were kind of like a UN E.F. Hutton, if you remember those commercials. People wanted to hear what we wanted to say because we were bringing something new to the typical discussion.
I'm going to show you that I actually studied theology. So you took the Mulieris Dignitatem, which is the encyclical of St. John Paul II on the dignity of women, and you made it universal, which is kind of the reason why I wanted to talk to you about it, because the church is global. I mean, the phrase, I know you'll cringe when I say it, it's a big church. Mm-hmm. But what does that mean to you now, knowing the work you did as an attaché? And I want to get to that word because I don't think a lot of people understand it.
Yeah. One of the most beautiful things of representing the Holy See at the United Nations was that we were able to count on the work of Catholics all over the globe on the ground. What they were doing there put into practice and put flesh on the principles we were describing. We don't merely talk about the poor. We bring poor people to Rome. We don't merely talk about victims of human trafficking, but we bring some of the survivors of human trafficking that are being ministered to by sisters in Uganda or in Albania, etc. We don't just talk about the dignity of people with disabilities. Every March 21st, we would take those with Down syndrome to the United Nations, March 21st, 321 for a third 21st chromosome as those with Down syndrome have. And we would have them give speeches at the United Nations to show their great God-given gifts, their joy, everything else. So what we were able to do is we were able to marshal all the good that's being done by Catholics across the globe in education and healthcare, in poverty relief and care for our common home, all of it. And we were able to put a spotlight on that in the biggest international forum in the world. And for me, that was extraordinarily exhilarating.
And you now, looking back at your time there, one of the big issues right now globally is, and even the Holy Father mentioned about the dignity ascribed to people of same-sex attraction, LGBTQIA+. What would have been your take on that? Because obviously we know that they have inherent dignity, but ... What would you say? I mean, what would your speeches be about?
So when I first got to the UN in 2015, LGBT issues were not really on the agenda.
Interesting.
By about 2017, certain UN agencies, it's difficult to define the United Nations because the United Nations are really its 6 main organs. The Security Council, for example, the General Assembly, the ECOSOC Chamber, I won't go through all of them. But you've got agencies all over the world, and whenever any anybody in one of these agencies says something, it's almost as if the entire United Nations has spoken. That's not really true. But there were certain agencies at the UN who wanted to push the LGBT agenda, and they started a campaign that would never, ever pass through a General Assembly resolution or through the Security Council or any of their bodies to try to change the UN from within. So the Holy See did need to resist that. At the end of 2016.
And resist it. What does that mean?
So resist means that we try to give a voice to all those cultures who recognized the cultural imposition, what Pope Francis would call the cultural imperialism of the richer countries in the West, in an ideological way, to bring the sexual revolution to cultures in Latin America, to cultures in Africa, all over the place, who don't even have terms for this type of behavior. It's massive cultural imposition. So what we would try to do is we would try to help them articulate their own arguments and form coalitions. What sadly happened at the very end, the end of 2016, as Barack Obama was leaving the presidency in the U.S., the United States and the European Union were pushing for a new special rapporteur on LGBT issues, which was called SOGI, so sexual orientation and gender identity issues. And they had a vote, and it passed 70 to 68, which is 138 votes. There are 193 voting countries. Many of them just abstained. Many of them felt bullied because of the development assistance that comes from the U.S. and the EU to be pressured into supporting it, because there was heavy, heavy, heavy influence happening there. And so we've never been able to revisit that. What we would do for our arguments, which was your question, is we'd always talk about the dignity of everybody. For us as Christians, we know that Jesus has died for everybody, no matter what his sexual orientation is.
Sure.
But at the same time, there are goods that would be lost that the cultures of the world very much value, like the changing of the meaning of family, the changing of the meaning of marriage, and ultimately, as we've seen with the trans movement much more lately, changing of what it means to be a human person, that we are made body and soul, rather than just we wake up one day and we think we're a man trapped in a woman's body or vice versa, which we need to treat these people with compassion, but we can't make it the new baseline of what it means to be a human being.
I want to get to that in just a second with your work, especially at Columbia University, because I'm sure it's very present. What does the word attaché even mean? So
attaché is a French word that just means attached.
Yep.
That you are... you're from outside the system, but you have been brought inside for a particular task. And so I was a priest of the Diocese of Fall River who happened to speak several languages, who was capable of writing, capable of the precision you need in diplomatic work. And so the Archbishop, the Nuncio, asked my bishop if I'd be permitted to become attached to the Holy See's diplomatic corps in order to assist in its efforts at the UN.
Did you like this job?
I loved the work that I was doing. I recognize that the Holy See's work at the United Nations is really genuinely important and influential. At the same time, I probably had 5 full-time jobs there. So at the end of 7 years, I was kind of exhausted.
Well, you kind of loved that. I know you did. Don't lie. Don't lie. I know you did. But I got to ask you this too. Like, how did you deal with? Because you said it's about diplomacy, but it sounds like it's terribly political. How did you deal with that?
Well, so there are political issues with a diplomatic methodology.
And so it sounds passive aggressive.
Well, so pretty much when those who are in favor of abortion are trying to put in what they call sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is just the euphemism for abortion and contraception, right? When they're trying to put that into resolutions on the open-ended working group on aging, is if 80-year-olds need abortion and contraception, you had to be full-time vigilant. And you needed to recognize that those were very politically driven agendas that you needed to combat with diplomatic means. And so we always needed to be on high alert. We needed to keep member states informed, and we needed to put up that resistance. There at the United Nations, to a large degree, we were playing defense more than offense.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And a lot of the times we were able to thwart real mischief that was taking place. Not always, but in many cases, quietly behind the scenes, we were able to help the countries who see things the way that Catholics normally see things triumph against those who are trying to impose their immorality on the world.
So just one more thought on the UN, and then I want to go to your current work as the Catholic chaplain for Colombia. There are some people, because obviously the UN is primarily funded by the United States. There are other contributing countries, but nothing to the degree of the United States. There are many Americans, especially even Catholic Americans, that say we should just get rid of it. What are your thoughts on that?
So the United Nations, if it didn't exist, would have to be founded in order to have somebody to prevent war. It came out of the ashes of the Second World War to try to prevent World War III.
That was a Freudian slip, wasn't it?
It was. I'm sure that can be edited straight out, Father Leo. But it came out of World War II in order to prevent World War III. And it has, to a large degree, provided a means by which you can talk about some of the major issues in a amicable enough way to try to prevent the only recourse to bilateral war, one-on-one war situations. So it's important in that regard. The issue, the real struggles of the United Nations were identified by Pope Pius XII even before the UN was founded. He said, the Security Council, if the UN's purporting to be an organization where all nations are equal, it can't really be equal if 5 countries have a permanent veto in the Security Council so that they don't have to really participate in the process. And that's clearly an issue, as we see in the Ukraine with the Russian Federation being on the Security Council. He said if the UN General Assembly doesn't have any mechanism by which to enforce its resolutions, it's just going to become the world's most prestigious debating society where there are no teeth of anything else. Again, he was prophetic even in that. And so the UN has some real issues that have got to be looked at, but it is important that it exists. And for the U.S., when President Trump at the beginning of his administration, because of the just criticisms against the United Nations, I mean, there are many just criticisms, decided to pull funding from a lot of areas, like he totally pulled the U.S.'s funding for the UN Fund for Population Assistance, which is basically international abortion.
Exactly.
He had great ground to do that, but as soon as he did, what the U.S. was giving was taken over by the Nordic countries that are gung-ho in favor of abortion. I would have rather had the U.S. say, because we're the biggest donor of this agency, I'm going to put a whole bunch of U.S. pro-lifers on its board to control its direction. When the U.S. pulled a lot of its budget and wasn't paying its budget, China stepped in.
Got it.
In order to take over some of the positions that the U.S. had been able to steer in a particular direction. Now the Chinese, for example, took over meetings management.
Got it.
So civil society, many of these groups from around the world that want to speak about human rights abuses, they're now having to go through way more red tape in order to even just get a room. And so our subtraction at the level of the U.S. led other countries to be able to fill that vacuum.
That's interesting.
And that's not always in the U.S.'s best interest, and it's clearly not for the international common good.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I know that you have to basically sign an NDA. You can't disclose anything there. But what was the most challenging thing you had to write about or deal with?
At the United Nations, there were a lot of very emotional topics that were always difficult to describe. For me, this isn't part of the confidentiality that I needed to do, but we were running an event on human trafficking, and we wanted to get various representatives from the world who were coming on over. And I brought a Ugandan Sister Mary Angel Akayo in, and she didn't have much experience making a PowerPoint. I was working with her one afternoon to edit her PowerPoint. And she was talking about this description of courtship rape in her PowerPoint. I said, "Sister, what's this about?" She said, "This is when a 30 or 40-year-old guy drags a 9-year-old girl into the bush, rapes her, and then comes back into the village, meets her parents, and says, I have robbed your daughter's virginity. If you allow me to take her now as my wife, I will give you a cow in return. And I asked Sister Mary Angel, I said, how many take them up? Oh, 100%. I said, what? She said, because that was the same situation that happened to their mother. That was the same situation that happened to their grandmother. And so I totally changed the entire of her entire PowerPoint to be able to bring this really disturbing phenomenon to everybody's notice. I hadn't heard about it. Nobody at the UN had heard about it, but it was a cultural thing in Northeast Uganda. And so we had to deal with a lot of these really revolting practices in different parts of the world that had to be described so that they could be addressed. Wow. There were many good things on the other side, but the more difficult things that I had to do was to get into the darkness of some of the practices that were happening in the world and trying to bring it to the light.
Oh my God. I mean, speaking of revolting, you are now the chaplain. I'm kidding.
I wouldn't use that adjective, Father Leo.
Well, I say it because colleges these days seem to be presenting a lot of revolting results. Parents are sending their kids, spending tons of money, and they're coming out not only with just different color hair, but different identities, different just philosophies that are really not loving wisdom at all. See what I did there with the word philosophy? Pretty good, right? But I mean, they love ignorance. What's going on in universities?
So in universities, there's a real battle happening for its future, and whether it's really going to seek the truth so that the truth can be lived, or whether it's really about particular outcomes that are going to make certain subsections feel better. So rather than being about a search for truth, it's become a means to be able to coddle feelings. Columbia is interesting.
It is.
I had certain. I'm a graduate of Harvard, as you know,
Yeah.
Leo, and I anticipated Columbia would be much like Harvard is today with regard to some of the ways that it has regressed from the search for truth in the 30 years since I was there. But Columbia has still kept its core curriculum, and so they're still reading a lot of the classics.
They are.
Columbia is one place in which, just by the eyes, there hasn't been discrimination against bright students of particular ethnic groups that have happened at other campuses. And so the percentage of Asian Americans at Columbia is super high, and Asian Americans come, and what they really want to do is they want to study.
They want to learn.
And so they raise the bar. Those people who would want to go to college, for example, to get involved in identity movements, who would want to just go for a party environment and the whole rest of it, I haven't discovered that to anywhere near the degree that I anticipated I would at Columbia, because the students study really hard. For us, ministering to the Catholic students first. So when you come in as a chaplain, you have to work in concentric circles.
Sure.
The first are for the Catholics who are interested in practicing their faith, and then you go to the Catholics who aren't practicing the faith. Then you go to the Christians, and then you go to everybody. I mean, that's is essentially the progress that I want to make there. The Catholics who come, I would be satisfied 2 years from now, when I had entered, with the amount of zealous Catholics I have. They recognize now how much more they need what the Catholic Church gives, because they're surrounded by a culture in which certain things that could have been taken for granted 30 to 50 years ago are no longer being taken for granted, even what it means to be a human being. And so they are very hungry for what the Church gives. They want to have time to adore the Lord. They want to learn.
Well, let me get to that in just a second, but I will say this, that Columbia, they have this section there where they, I guess it's the sociology department, where they actually had a study on what makes a family healthy, and they pointed to the traditions of a regular family meal. CASA, the Center of Addictions and Substance Abuse, out of Columbia University. So that was impressive, but isn't it also challenging? And maybe this is where your diplomatic skills can be helpful. You're going to have to deal with administration, who I know, for lack of a better term, they would identify as woke. They would identify as part of the leftist agenda. How do they treat you? Are you kind of like this little silent observer, or are you a real part of Columbia's family?
Columbia is a very interesting place, and it has exceeded my expectations in a few areas. One of the things that Columbia does is it has a religious life office.
Do other colleges have that?
Most do not.
Really?
A real Harvard does not. A dean for religious life, not for religious studies as an academic discipline, but for religious life. And so what Columbia has is this dean. I have to go through a little bit of an orientation program there, but then I get the Columbia ID. I'm able to get into all the Columbia buildings. I'm able to do things as basically a Columbia staff member, even though I'm not paid by Columbia. Okay. We have regular meetings with the religious life advisors, is our technical term, through the office of other religions. We work together to try to bring God to the campus. To take one concrete example, we're going to be doing this spring. Columbia's had 3 suicides this year. Huh. I had met one of the kids who took his own life. He wasn't a Catholic, but he came to one of our orientation programs and he introduced himself, and I would never forget his last name. His name was Norris Pride. We can pray for him. But 3 suicides. And after Norris's suicide, the dean of the engineering school at Columbia put out a press release that was just inadequate to honor Norris, but also to help with the students who might become copycats, who are dealing with the anxieties and the stresses of life on campus in a way that just doesn't lead them to learn how to deal with their pain. So I went to the dean of religious life and I said to him, we've got to do better. One of the things that the religions of the world have real expertise in is how to deal well with human suffering. Catholics have the whole notion of the cross. Jews have the long experience of the sufferings, not to mention modern with the Shoah, the Holocaust. Buddhists have a very deep understanding of suffering. Sure. Muslims do. I said, wouldn't it be great if we would be able to share that wisdom with the students here at Columbia so that they recognize that there are more places to go than just psychological sciences and counseling centers who can help you to deal with some of your problems, but can't really describe for you how these moral sufferings can be converted into something good. And so the dean of religious life said, this is a great idea, let's do it, and we're going to be doing it in April. So these are the typical ways that we're able to interact with Columbia. Columbia wants students who desire to live by their faith to have access to the best means to do so. Okay. It surprises a lot of people when I describe this.
Because, there's a lot of Catholic parents who come to me because they know that I do work with some universities, and they'll say, which universities should I send my kid to? Columbia is not one of them, and I'm so sorry if Columbia is hearing this. You got a great spokesperson here, but I'm shocked to hear this. Why is this the case? In the middle of New York City, you're saying that there is a bastion for true thinking, true education, and the true pursuit of spiritual religious identity.
Part of what makes Columbia a little different is it's had a president, Lee Bollinger, for many years, who was firmly believed in free speech.
Interesting.
So that at a university, you shouldn't shout as if it can't even be talked about what people have considered truth for the entirety of Western civilization.
So if a Ben Shapiro or a Matt Walsh or a John Knowles goes out there, are we going to see riots and people kicking down doors?
So what actually happens at Columbia is you've got to make an application because they've got to study exactly what security needs to be done.
But they wouldn't stop it.
They review it, but they absolutely wouldn't stop it. And they might bring it to a bigger room to just make sure that there wouldn't be protests on the outside. They'll make sure that they've got the right access points and everything else for this, because even though the majority would disagree perhaps with the content, they recognize that on a college campus, the way to handle ideas with which you disagree is not to shame people and shout them off campus, but to engage them with arguments. And that aspect of the liberal tradition on universities is still alive at Columbia. I wasn't anticipating it when I got there, but I've been happy to discover that it's sincere. Now, that doesn't mean 100% of the administrators are on this page. There's some resistance on the inside. But institutionally, Columbia has the bodies to make sure those who would believe
Is
what
that
we
being
believe.
challenged, though?
Sure, it's being challenged even in classrooms. But to be clear, we had the Dean of Religious Life come to the newly opened Catholic Center that I helped to inaugurate, called the Thomas Merton Institute for Catholic Life at Columbia. And so we had him come over and address the students. And the students brought to him some issues that happen in class. For example, when a particular professor speaks disparagingly, about religious believers or the Christian faith, or with regard to a moral teaching, life, or premarital sex, you name it. They brought some of these issues up to him, and he said, listen, come to me with those. I will engage with the professors just to make sure that Christian believing students in class don't have to deal in a math class with something insulting to their faith and moral that's inappropriate. And he does intervene. And so the Columbia is surprising in those ways. And so I'd encourage parents who are listening to us with students of who might be attracted to Ivy Leagues to think about.
They would have to also get engaged in the Catholic chaplaincy program. The Catholic ministry program.
Well, we would invite them to.
We would invite. Okay.
They wouldn't necessarily have to. Would engage their freedom.
Now, Father Roger Landry, you are a unique priest. You are a diocesan priest, but you are. I think this is kind of like built for you. I mean, when we were in seminary, would we ever think we were doing the kind of work that we're doing?
I dreamed, Leo, that one day I would be on a television program with you in 2023.
Exactly.
And so
the cooking priest.
I can do my "Now, O Lord, let your servant depart from
the
peace"
cooking
moment.
priest and the itinerant preacher sitting here. But now you're kind of doing things on a global level again. So obviously you did the diocesan priest thing. You obviously were successful at it as a pastor, did some work for your diocesan newspaper, and now you're doing things on kind of a bigger picture. First of all, do you like doing this kind of stuff? I mean, it's kind of built for you in my thought. I love
being a priest. I love parish work. I am very happy to be a college chaplain at this age with these students and who keep me younger. And then
really?
all my work.
Younger.
Younger. I'm getting younger by the day.
I can see it.
And but also the international work and the writing, the EWTN. I've had the privilege to do the Papal Conclave.
Yes.
The funeral of Pope
But
Benedict.
you're also a missionary of mercy for the Vatican. That means that there were explain that briefly for people who aren't familiar with that term.
So Pope Francis back in 2016 during the Jubilee of Mercy appointed 1,100 priests around the world with his special abilities in the sacrament of confession to be able to make it easier for people throughout the world to access it. And he gave us the mission to preach about God's mercy and to lead with the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. So that's one of the most defining aspects of my priesthood.
It is.
I love that. And then you and I have both been appointed by the U.S. bishops, 2 of 56 national Eucharistic preachers. So I've been crisscrossing the country, speaking about the extraordinary gift that we have, the mind-blowing reality
of the Eucharist,
of Jesus in the Holy Eucharist, to try to stoke up people's love for Jesus, but also to help with their Eucharistic knowledge, the Eucharistic faith, their Eucharistic amazement, so that they might be able to live Eucharistic lives. And so to have the opportunity as a priest to preach a lot about God's mercy on the one hand, and about the sacrament of Christ's love, the Eucharist on the other, that is such a blessing for me, because I could preach until the end of time.
Really?
Just on these two topics.
I had no idea. And you would do it in such a diplomatic way.
And in a long-winded monological way.
See, again, big words. I mean, what is it? It's just like you have to have like 5 syllables in a word just so that, you could, I don't know, impress me. I'm already impressed.
Every once in a while, you throw in one of these big words that were once thrown at me by our favorite class.
Yeah, you know what? The beauty of something like this is that there is so much more to a priest, I think, and also the work of the church. It's inspiring. It is incredible. I mean, when we were putting some lists together of people I wanted to interview, you were truly on the top of that list because I find your work fascinating and inspiring, even if you made fun of me as a seminarian, you know?
Leo, we were in a big crowd. But we likewise knew you could take it because for those who don't know Father Leo very well, martial arts black belt, who we all knew could easily take us down. So we gave it to him before he gave it.
Oh, good Lord. We're going to bring this to an end before I just vomit at the game. But no, really, it's a pleasure. And again, I'm just going to say that the work that you're doing is inspiring, super informative. I'd love to be able to kind of delve a little bit more deeply into the topics, especially for college students and the parents who are obviously so stinking worried about their kids. And we've got to figure out maybe ways to help the parents and all that. So I definitely want to come back. And maybe what would be great would be to maybe interview some of the students at your chaplaincy, if that would be
I look forward to that sequel.
Yeah, I would love that. So listen, where can people learn more about the work that you do?
So I'd encourage people to go to CatholicPreaching.com, which is
.com. I think you're part.
Where all my talks are listed, including the ones that I'm giving for the National Eucharistic Revival or for Mercy. Likewise, the daily preaching that I give for the students up at Columbia is
excellent.
Are listed there. And then Columbia Catholic Ministry has a website as well that describes what we're trying to do for students. So any parents, for example, or students 17 or 18 thinking about where they might want to go to college, if they'd like to find out more about what we're trying to do up in Morningside here in Manhattan, love to have a chance to chat with them. My email, if anybody wants to reach out with questions, is a very easy one, catholicpriest@columbia.edu.
Wow.
Columbia gives the religious life advisors email addresses because they do consider us part of the institution in serving the students. And so catholicpriest@columbia.edu.
And that is awesome for such an observer as well as someone who's not just observing. You're in the mix. And so trust in my prayer for you. I absolutely love this. And again, our special guest today was Father Roger Landry. Too many titles, too many genitives, but he's just a faithful priest doing good work locally and globally. We'll see you next time on the Father Leo Show. God bless.